Well, for the past few days, I've kind of let it slip out that we're, or just told different individuals that I'm starting a series on Job, and the collective response is, ooh. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but this is one of the books that while we were on our sabbatical back in August and September, I kicked around the idea of whether I should do a series in Job, and kind of went away from that idea, and then the Lord brought me back to it. And I don't know about you, I wrote this last week for last week's sermon, but that got postponed. But it was right after the New Year, and everybody makes New Year's resolutions, right? Or not everybody, I guess, because I don't. But that's kind of the thing to do every year. But I doubt anybody made a resolution that they wanted to endure suffering, right? We don't normally invite suffering. We don't invite hard times. We don't look forward to it. But inevitably, they do come. But typically, we're praying for everyone else. We're praying for peace. We're praying for happiness. We pray that everything will go okay in our lives, don't we? We don't typically say, Lord, test me again. I can handle it. That's not what we pray for. We strive in our lives for everything to be taken care of, every need to be met, every crisis evaded, and if at all possible, but inevitably, troubles do find us. Mankind has been walking through troubles for the past 2 years, obviously before that, but collectively, our world has gone through the struggles that we all share them from every continent, from every nation, what we've been dealing with over the last 2 years with COVID-19 and all the other mess that's gone along with it. And as I was thinking about preaching through this book, as we're coming off this joyful Christmas season, I thought, man, this would be a great downer, right? Let's encourage people with this depressing book. But in all actuality, guys, we are either coming out of a trial, right, in life. We're either coming out of one, or we're being found in one, or we're about to go into one. And how many times when we go through trials in our lives, it's going to take one of two paths typically. It's either going to be part of drawing us closer to God, or we get discouraged and sometimes makes us walk away from God. It's my hope that by going through the book of Job and even just processing how he dealt with what he went through, that we can gain some perspective. I know that in this room, the interesting thing about going through this book is I know a lot of what's going on in each and every one of your lives. And I know that even as I originally, would go to you and say, hey, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. And then when I really press, or maybe I don't have to press, maybe just open up to me, I start to hear about the trials that we're all going through. I think every single one of us could pinpoint a trial that we're going through right now, couldn't we? I think it's one of those inevitable things. And the struggle is we can get to the point to where we start to question God's goodness, because why are we having to go through this? Why are we having to go through these trials? And we had the privilege of, at least last week, having our small group with Mike and Kim and the deacon candidates and their wives. And we're going through experiencing God. And we got to talk about the names of God and how we have seen God's character lived out in our own lives. How we've experienced God in that particular way. Whether it's God as my provider, or God as my redeemer, my salvation, my refuge, my peace. All those different names of God and how we've experienced those. Knowing God, not just about Him, but truly knowing Him, is to experience Him. Sometimes our experiences in life can tend to reflect poorly on God, at least in our minds and from our perspective. That can cause us to question whether we can truly trust God. Our ability to see God's goodness and trust Him through our trials and suffering will either cause us to walk away from God or draw us to Him. Our common response to trials is either we're going to blame God or we're going to blame man. And that's a lot of the format for what we see in Job. The truth that we tend to operate in is God is just. And so if God is just, then he rules by justice. Doesn't it stand to reason that way? So if man is knowing that man is evil, God is just, man is evil. So if everything's good, then man must be good. I must be doing everything okay. How many of you have ever experienced a trial or something went bad in your life and you're like, oh man, what did I do? What did God's getting me back for something? Am I the only one? Okay, thank you for another couple of hands there. So if life stinks, on the opposite side of this, if life stinks, then man stinks or he's done something wrong. Unfortunately, life is so much more complex than that. The problem we face is that we tend to focus on what we see with our eyes and conceive with our brains, but what is beyond this, our senses, is a cosmic battle plot that is going on behind the curtain of this physical world. We see what we see, and we know what we know, at least with God and man, and so we find somebody to blame. Somebody's at fault for what's going on. In our lives as humans, the main question that we want answered is God good? The second is God worth trusting? All the while, the ultimate question, who gets to determine the answer to those questions? Who has the authority, let alone the proper perspective, to determine whether God is good or God can be trusted? In chapter 1 of Job, we're introduced to our main character in this historical story. A story based in the land of Uz, not the land of Oz, but the land of Uz. It's an unfamiliar area to most Bible readers. It's somewhere east of Israel. Actually, nobody in this story is an Israelite. Yet it's in the Bible, in Israel's poetry and wisdom books. A couple of indications that we have as to the time frame, because it's actually known as the oldest book in the Bible, is one of the characters that will be introduced in a couple of weeks. His name is Eliphaz. He is actually the son of Esau, Jacob's brother. So you have Jacob, who became Israel, leading in his 12 sons, and that's the 12 tribes of Israel. And over here you have Esau, and he had Eliphaz, and so that kind of gives you a time frame. So in the generations of the 12 tribes, or the 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. It's known as the oldest book and written before Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, because you had Jacob who took his sons to Egypt. All of his sons died off, and then Moses brought them back, and then he wrote the 5 books. So this was written before that. In the first 5 verses of the book of Job, we get introduced to this guy. He's blameless. He's upright. He's God-fearing, and one who turned away from evil. We also know that he's well off. Back then, you didn't have big fat bank accounts. You had a lot of animals. You had plentiful crops and that kind of thing. So he's well off. He's even known as the greatest of all in the East. He was also the father of many children. Evidently, these kids liked to party, because they'd celebrate birthdays and evidently have a pretty wild time. And that would cause Job, who was a righteous man, to go and offer burnt offerings for his children, because maybe they did something they weren't supposed to do. So this is the man that we get introduced to. This is the character. And what's interesting about Job and the book of Job is we kind of flip back and forth, at least in the beginning. We flip back and forth from earth to heaven, and then back to earth, and then back to heaven, and then back to earth. We see in verse 6 that there is a staff meeting happening in heaven. God is on the throne. He's meeting with all of his angels, and what I like about this is Satan's required to be there, because God is still in authority over Satan. Even though God has given Satan over to be the god of this world, he's referred to in the Bible as the god of this world. And so we see this setting in heaven. I want to read in verse 6 here. We're going to cover 2 chapters tonight. I'm going to try and read as fast as I can. It says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, known as the accuser, that's what Satan means, is the accuser. And Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil? And then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. It's so common, especially if you read this, to go, see, God didn't even stop him. God didn't even stand in his way. Why would God even allow Satan to do something? As I've processed, and I'm not one of the great minds in the world. I think if you know me, you know that. Okay? But I'm a pretty practical person, or I like to think I am. Joanna occasionally sets me straight on that. But as I process through why God allows bad things to happen to good people, isn't that the most common question? Why does God let bad things happen to good people? By the way, this book is not going to answer that question. It just doesn't answer it. Here's the situation. God created the earth. He doesn't want a bunch of robots that he's programmed to love him. He said, here you go. I created you. I love you, and I want you to love me, but it's up to you. It's your choice. And you get to choose whether you're going to follow me. You get to choose whether you're going to live for me. And occasionally, I'm going to allow things to happen to you just to test to see where you're at. Just to test your resolve. Whether you're truly going to be dedicated to me and have a proper perspective on who's doing this, or whether you're going to turn on me the second that something bad happens. God allowed Satan to touch everything but Job. He didn't tell Job to do a single thing. He didn't give him ideas. He didn't say, hey, get him this way. He just put it in Satan's hands. So let's read about what he did. And I think my comment about the weather earlier may make a little bit more sense after we read this. In verse 13, it says, now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing with the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another that said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Wave upon wave upon wave of bad news. And we know that this is not God doing this, but look at what he used. He used people. Satan even called down fire from heaven, even though the servant says it was God's fire from heaven. And he also had control of the wind. Well, why do I point that out? Because we see all of these things that God created, including people sometimes, like the Chaldeans and the Sabeans, or however you say that name. And we go, why does God make this stuff happen? Why does God allow it to happen? Why did God bring the wind? Why did God bring the snow? Why did he bring the ice? And I'm not blaming Satan for the snow or the ice, okay? But I want us to understand that Satan can use these things to test us. He can use people to test us. He can use situations and trials to test us. It's important that we note here how Job processed all of this. You think about it. He's lost his wealth. He's lost his children. And this is Job's response. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshiped. He didn't fall on the ground and curse God. He didn't fall on the ground and kill himself or yell and scream, hurt somebody else. He fell on the ground and he worshiped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. What I want us to gather from all of that, first of all, is that God was on the throne and in charge from the beginning. Satan, the accuser, is the one wanting to go and do all the bad stuff to Job. And I want us to note Job's response. We're going to cover chapter 2 here in just a second. But it's nice to read those words, naked I came into this world, naked shall I go, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And we want that to be our response, don't we? We want that to be where we're at. We've got a whole book, 42 chapters, by the way. This is not going to be a 42-week series, by the way. Just to set your mind at ease. Job is going to go through every emotion that there is. He's going to go through everything. And we're going to see how his friends and his wife want him to process things, how they view God and how they view what is happening to Job and how they interpret it. But ultimately, this is the truth. What he states here is the truth. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Let's look over at chapter 2, because here we're going to see that Satan wasn't happy with what happened. He wasn't pleased, because what did Job not do? He did not curse God to his face. All of this stuff that Satan accused God of doing for Job, God goes, okay, there's no hedge of protection. Just don't mess with Job. And he took it all away, and Job remained faithful. In chapter 2, we pick up back in heaven. Another staff meeting is happening. It says, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So he's not just there chilling out, hiding in the back. He's there. He's got to be held accountable because he is God's creation and God still has authority over him. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Now, I don't know about you at this point. If I was Job, I'd be like, all right, God, can you pick on somebody else? But Job had remained faithful, even though he had lost everything externally. I think that's the difference between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1 was, I lost everything out here, and chapter 2 is going to be, now I'm personally being attacked. Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him. Did you catch that? Even though you incited me against him. What did that servant say? God's fire came down from heaven. That's what Satan's job is, guys. He is the accuser. He's the one that gets in there and blames us and accuses us before the Lord. And then Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. All that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch in his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery, which this just paints such a vivid picture. He took a piece of pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in ashes. In other words, his sores were oozing pus. Dinner's over, so I can talk about this. He's scraping the scabs and the wound, trying to press the pus out of the sores, and he's covered from his head to the bottom of his foot. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." Nothing like a supportive wife. But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil?" In all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. In verse 11, we see these three friends come on the scene. And it's going to be interesting to get to know these guys and how their minds work, and even what has influenced them as they sit there and try and counsel their friend. And I don't know about you, I've visited a few people in the hospital. I've visited a few people in hospital beds at home as a pastor. And I will say this, just as a word of encouragement, should you find out a friend of yours is in the hospital and you're scared to go because you just don't know what to say. Can I just say, you don't need to say anything. The friend that says, you were there for me. They don't typically say, well, you came in and you spoke wisdom and you spoke encouragement. No, you're just there. And that's what these friends do, at least for 7 days. It says here in verse 11 in chapter 2, it says, "Now when Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him." That's how mangled Job's body and his face was, that they didn't even recognize him. "And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great." 7 days. It's actually the time period that is standard when you're mourning someone's death. And we really don't know the time frame from when his children died to when these friends showed up, but I would imagine it was somewhere in the same neighborhood. If they're not mourning the death of the children, they might as well be mourning Job, because he's as good as dead. Unrecognizable. Sitting in a pile of ashes, which is pretty accustomed, kind of a customary thing to do when you're mourning, when you're repenting. You're kind of placing yourself in this low place. And he's sitting there scraping his sores. They came to show comfort and sympathy. So many times we read from the beginning of this story and see Job's response and think, man, I hope I can react that way, or have that much faith. Or maybe even, I don't think I could react that way. Can I even say what I think to God? Is that sinful? Can he take it? Will he punish me for being angry with him? All those questions will be answered as we read this book. There will be some weeks when I attempt to cover large portions of Scripture, and I want to encourage you when we get there, I'll warn you next week what chapters we're going to cover, because I'm not going to cover 15 chapters in one night reading the whole thing. Okay? Carly says, good. You're welcome. I'll give you those chapters ahead of time. Next week we're going to be covering chapter 3, one chapter, and then we're going to dive into this conversation that these friends have with Job. And it almost sounds like, oh my gosh, we're going to cover. That's like watching a documentary, a really boring documentary. But what we need to process through when we cover these conversations is how they're reasoning, is how we tend to reason. How we approach suffering and trials is how they're going to tend to approach it. And I want us to hear everything that Job says and everything that he feels, because I guarantee you, as you walk through it, you're going to be able to relate to him. You're going to be able to relate to times that he wishes that he had never been born, that he laments the day that he was conceived. The book of Job holds every emotion and every thought that the human race could ever have as they're enduring suffering. And as I said before, the way that we respond in our suffering toward the Lord will really set the course for how we walk out our faith. The main thing I want us to start to see is that through all of life, God is in charge and in control, but he has given us over to our sinful ways and given Satan and his angels permission to bring trials and suffering in this present age. He doesn't tell them what to do. He tells them how far they can go. He's not punishing us. He's not doing anything to us. He is allowing us to go through trials and suffering in the hopes that we will have the right perspective on who's to blame and how we deal with it. Through everything, he is still there for us. He is for us. He's just not a God that wants robot followers. He's just not a God that's going to make us do things. He doesn't make us love him. He invites us to love him. He invites us to look to him when we face trials. God offers the free choice to us to choose to believe he's good, to choose to trust him because he's worth trusting. When we can't see the end in sight, we can trust him because he sees the light at the end of our tunnel, and he's seen it before the beginning of time.